Hi guys. I'm doing my last reading of the chapter of the Phoenix and the Falcon. It's chapter 28. Just waiting for my stream to click in. You know, this book I've been promoting. The next thing I've got going is a sci-fi fantasy book, which I pretty much finished. I'm just editing it with somebody. So I'm not sure if I'll be doing much live reading with that yet, but Phoenix and the Falcon, it's kind of, look at the red light. Here, how about that? Da-da-da. Just waiting for my caster to click in. So we've had a very rainy, miserable day here in New Jersey. And it's cold weather. So, anyhow. I just wish it wasn't so slow, you know? It just waits for stream. Here we go. It is here. I just had to look at it. And technology, as it is, it works. And as you remember in the beginning, I was on my laptop downstairs and thought it was a nice setup. I didn't want to be here because I got too much stuff, too many books around. This is my office. This is where I write. And so I put up my Oriental rug screen, which I think is quite fitting with the book, you know. But, so chapter 28. As we remember, Helena has encountered her father. Turns out he doesn't really care much about her as a person. He sees her more as a tool. And because she's a woman, she's something to be used as, well, we could say chattel in terms of his ambitions for prestige and power as a, you know, someone to marry off. And this is what happened. We're very lucky, even though it's not perfect in society. As women, we have a lot more rights. Anyway, chapter 28. Arsames entered Attila's tent. At odds with his pettiness, his posture was erect, and he moved with poise, hinting at his illustrious heritage. His mouth was a gash of contempt. He made no attempt to hide his loathing of his present situation. 2 Persian soldiers followed him, carrying a medium-sized wooden chest suspended between 2 poles. He pointed his forefinger at Attila, imperiously ordering them to replace their heavy burden at the Hun's feet. Arsames' hands clapped in dismissal, and the Persian escort withdrew soundlessly. He took his position by Michaelia, grumbling audibly under his breath. It's too much. Half would have been enough. The chest was locked. With a smooth movement, Michaelia drew forth a slender chain with a key that hung around his neck. He raised it over his head and extended his hand. Attila signaled a guard to accept the key, otherwise appeared to be indifferent to the chest. Arsames gasped at the heap of golden coins, intermixed with sparkling stones. Attila was silent, his face devoid of expression. Slowly he leaned down to select a single gold piece, then a few gems. He bit the coin, testing its quality. Ignoring Michaelia, he strode to the tent's entrance. A servant leapt to open the flap and held it open uncertainly, unsure of his master's intentions. All watched as Attila methodically raised its jewel toward the declining sun. As he re-entered the tent flap dropped behind him with a whisper. Michaelia, he said, dropping the valuables into the strongbox. The gold is pure, bearing the seal of your empire. But disappointed in the quality of the gems, they are all at best semi-precious. Still, I accept your token of thanks. For 2 small concessions, I'll release Rodinia to your care. Michaelia frowned. Name your conditions. First, I want the scribe. Though he's clumsy as a horseman, he might be useful. Agreed. He waits for the 2 hostages. Thank you. The other will be more difficult. If I give you Rodinia, you must relinquish any legal claim to your daughter. She's old enough to make her own life. Michaelia glared at him. I waive any claims over my daughter under Roman law, he said, his voice low, like a snake hissing. Attila beamed at him. Excellent. And what are the laws of Persia, the Sassanian Empire? Impossible. The emperor would never allow me to forfeit my rights over my own flesh. Attila chuckled and dismissed the argument with a shrug of his shoulders. We will not travel to Persia. Your claim on your daughter lacks jurisdiction. Helena studied her father's face and was chilled. His expression was that of a fanatic, fixated on his salvation at any price. With abhorrence, she pictured life at the Persian court. They sought to make her into a living mannequin. Her will and her passion would be crushed. Fear of poison or worse, an assassin's blade, would become her daily reality should she return. She shuddered. Attila clapped his hands. Bring Rodinia, he shouted. Within moments, the woman was half escorted, half dragged into the tent. Her heels resisted and pressed into the ground. Her cheeks were bruised, and her dress was torn. Glancing at Attila, she tossed her head and spat, but tried to keep away from his reach. When she saw Michaelia, her eyes widened, and her face abruptly turned ashen. She threw herself to the ground, groveling, and her hands clutched his ankles. Get up, he commanded in Persian. She obeyed quickly, bowing her head in submission. With an open palm, he struck her cheek hard. She fell. Now you may abase yourself before me, he said with a smile. Arisames laughed. Attila breathed deeply, inhaling the violence. Thirsting for revenge, Michaelia had forgotten everything, even Altir, whimpering with fear. Helena held the quivering child. She turned to Valimir. Please, take us from here. He was indifferent, bored by the prospect of Rodinia's interrogation. As you wish, we are not needed. Altir would be more comfortable with Attila's wives. Helena firmly persisted. Valimir nodded in agreement. Beside Michaelia, Attila's face shimmered with anticipation. Tell her I'll have my men skin her alive, slowly, one layer at a time, unless she confesses all she knows, Don said in Greek, rubbing his hands together. We were gentle with her before. Michaelia smiled darkly, 2 conspirators in harmony. As he translated Attila's suggestion to Rodinia, Helena carried Altir outside. Another man noticed their departure. The sun held low in the sky, casting long shadows throughout the camp. The aroma of meat cooking drifted in the cold breeze. Underlying the hymn of activity, birds called to each other, signaling the end of the day. Away from her father, Helena felt as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. It had hurt, as if she had been running hard. Soft footfalls followed them. She wheeled with alarm, but saw only Karatapan. She exhaled with relief, loosening the tension in her chest. Will you stay near in case Altir needs you? I'll be just outside. They walked a few paces to the women's tent behind Attila's headquarters. To the guard stationed outside, Valimir requested the head wife. She answered the summons quickly. A remarkably pretty woman. She was just a little younger than Attila. She listened carefully to Valimir's explanation and gestured for Helena to enter. Inside the light was murky, and the fire was low. Helena did not relinquish her grasp on Altir, but the wives clustered around her, smiling affectionately as a child. Altir smiled shyly, concealing a yawn behind her hand. Helena was stern. You're exhausted, Altir. Did you have enough to eat? She nodded. Good, you need sleep. You have a long journey before you. Rest while you can. Can you stay with me? For a little while. Helena placed Altir on a soft sleeping pallet and carefully nestled her doll beside her. Attila's head wife spoke in rapid Hunnic to the others, mentioning Altir by name several times. Helena ignored the discussion. She hummed a soft lullaby, her eyes fastened on the child's sweet face, which showed signs of strain of her ordeal. Once Altir slept, Helena faced Attila's wives. Words failed her suddenly. Suddenly, she was assaulted by the image of Rodinia, bleeding and alone with Michaelia and Attila. Both were different, but so alike in their quest to devour their prey. In his passion, her father had not even considered Altir, the child he had professed to love, should not witness his interrogation. She stammered haltingly in her rudimentary Gothic. Altir needs sleep. The first wife's smile was warm. We will watch the child. Kratipan waits outside, Helena said. It's too cold for him out there. He's old, no threat to Attila's honor. The woman laughed, waving her hand at the hearth. He can sit by our fire. Thank you, Helena said, the woman's kindness bringing tears to her eyes. With sharp, poignancy, she remembered her friend Ariana and the way her face had lit up with an impish smile. As she returned outdoors, her throat ached. She wanted to run to Valamir and be enveloped by him, obliterating her memories. But she controlled herself and walked to him with measured steps. She reached for his hand and looked down to conceal her tears. They said Kratipan could wait inside. Valamir lifted her chin and looked into her eyes. Wordlessly, he pulled her to his chest. Comforted, she relaxed in his arms. Kratipan, he said, speaking over her head. What do you think? I'm too infirm to be a hazard to Attila's wives. Warm yourself at their fire, but take care. Don't I always? Quietly, Kratipan asked permission to enter. The flap closed behind him, dampening the lively sounds of the women's greetings. Valamir kissed her lips. We need to be alone, he said. Rodinia's scream shattered the moment, as she pleaded desperately for mercy. Trembling, Helena reached for Valamir. I want to be with you, but I'm so afraid. For now my father is occupied, but soon it'll be my turn. I saw his face. He won't give up. He'll have from me what he wants. The worst of my grandfather. I feel so frightened like a little girl. Do you think the shaman could help? Valamir held her firmly. I'll take you to him, I promise, but it'll have to be later. He kissed her forehead, then her lips. His breath stroked her ear. Come with me. Her body answered his embrace and soothed her turmoil. I'll go with you, Valamir. His smile was broad. Hassan, he called. The roan cantered toward them, whinnying, and reminded Helena of Pasiel. An attendant ran to catch the animal. Reaching Valamir, the stallion pulled his chin to his neck and halted, as if for inspection. Without a word, the slave gave up the chase and shook his head. Valamir laughed, patting Hassan on the neck, and praised his performance. In contrast, Pasiel, unperturbed, walked quietly alongside his groom. Did you think your horse was the only one who could learn a few tricks? He asked her, his eyes twinkling. Did you teach him that? Maybe, maybe not. She laughed. As they rode back, her body moved in easy rhythm to Pasiel's smooth canter. He waited outside and stared at the sunset, his face a study in melancholy. Valamir dismounted, but before Helena could follow his example, he had her in her arms. Don't take off Hassan's saddle, but unbridle him. I'll need him again, he said to Rhys. Don't let anybody disturb us. We've much to discuss in private. Rhys kept his expression neutral, but his eyes were amused. Inside the tent, the fire burned low, but the coals were hot. Valamir lowered her to their bed. His hands were a soft caress. Putting a finger to his lips, he whispered, Wait. As he placed sticks on the hearth, the flames rekindled, leaping up in orange and blue. His eyes fixed on her, he took off his tunic and dropped it on the ground. He laid beside her, his lips a fervent caress on her brow, her cheeks, and her mouth. As he removed her clothing, her passion escalated, demanding release. For a fleeting instant, she saw in her mind's eye her father's disapproving face. The image vanished, overwhelmed by a wave of ecstatic sensation. Afterwards, she rested in Valamir's arms in comfortable silence. When he kissed her again, she returned to his embrace without restraint. They merged together once again. Their emotions were charged with delicious intensity. Finally, their passion complete, Helena met Valamir's eyes. With a chuckle, she smiled. "Why are you laughing?" he said, frowning. "It's hard to explain, but when I'm alone with you, my father becomes absurd. He only hears the thoughts in his head. He forgets to listen to his heart." She set her laughter aside. "But you, Valamir, my husband, remain true to yourself, perfect for me, a civilized woman. Our worlds are irreconcilable. They remain one." He smiled, his arms drawing her close. "You have my heart, Helena." His face tightened. "I don't trust your father. He'll not go so easily without you. You're more important for his plans than he has revealed." For Helena, her father was far away, a subject not worth considering. Naked, they rested in each other's arms, drowsily content. Later, when they heard angry voices outside, it was a shock. They sat up, pulling on their clothes with surprising speed. Rees shouted, "You're not to enter." "Michelia," Attila said, "I don't know what the custom is among civilized Persians, but we respect a closed tent flap. Wait." Silence met Attila's injunction. Then her father shouted, "Helena, I've come to speak with you." "I'll be a moment," she said, combing her hair. She felt Valamir's eyes and looked up. "Until tonight," he whispered. Her father repeated his call. "Helena." "I don't want to see him," she said, suddenly weary. "He'll argue, trying to persuade me, and not listen to when I say no." "I'll be your translator. I think he understands the point of a sword." She shook her head. "I won't have him touched. After we've said our farewells, I'll wait for you here during the hostage exchange. The farther away from Michelia, the safer I feel." When they emerged together from the tent, the sun was an orange ball, streaking the sky with purple and gold. Her father was astride his black horse. Altair was in his arms. He surveyed Helena, his face cold with contempt. Behind his arrogant mask, she sensed his rage. "Did Rodinia confess?" she asked in Greek. "She only implicated her husband. I remain dissatisfied," Michelia said. What could they have gained? What could they gain from kidnapping Altair? "They planned to poison the entire royal family. Rodinia's husband, Oxartes, planned to marry Altair and declare himself emperor. As the others stand in the line before Altair, she was not adequately guarded. It will not happen again." How could they get close enough to the emperor to poison him? That's what I need to discover. The mystery remains unsolved until we have Oxartes in our custody. Why does Altair have the royal pendant? Each of the 20 heirs possesses the emblem. Your child would be so honored. No, Father. Chance has brought us together. Choice takes us apart. Despite our differences, I'm pleased to know that you are well. Be gentle with Altair. She saw things that no child should behold. "Aren't you coming with us?" Altair asked. Helena answered her in Persian. "No, but I wish you joy." Why aren't you? Uncle Michele promised you would." "I can't. My life is with my husband." "I'll miss you." "And I'll miss you, too. Grow strong. Remember me. I'm sure that your aunt, my father's wife, will love you as her own." Her? Don't you know anything? She doesn't care about anybody except Uncle. Everyone in the harem knows what happens to pretty girls who catch Uncle's eye when she tricks them into drinking her special wine. Helena's eyes narrowed. Even a child knew the truth about Michelia's wife. She was a murderess, sacrificing her husband's yearning for an heir on an altar of jealousy. How long will I last at court? How many murders will you allow your wife? Be careful, Father. You could be next, Helena said, her voice vibrating with anger. For the moment, Michelia's shoulders slumped, and his face was drawn. Arsemes, Helena said, is this true? Do all my father's young brides unexpectedly years before their time? Unable to meet her eyes, he shrugged. Michelia found his voice, but his Persian was harsh, like rock scraping rock. I can't believe anyone would dare touch you, Helena. You carry the old blood. Altair is only a child. She doesn't understand. You must honor your duty to your ancestors. Come home and fulfill your obligation. Helena switched back to Greek. I owe you nothing. I remain with my husband. Stop. I won't listen to you further. You don't understand the magnitude of what you spurn. I owe you nothing, she repeated. I gave you life. Your mother died birthing you. And what would she say? Would she tell me to embrace a loveless marriage, to abandon the man I love? Michelia's eyes twitched. Where would I send you a letter? Helena asked. Do you think I'll settle for letters, Helena? You are my daughter. It's your duty to stay. Only a fool fights the inevitable, Michelia, Valimir said. And you don't have the look of a stupid man. Instruct your daughter how to reach you. The veins on Michelia's neck stood out. You are impertinent. He squared his shoulders, exerting self-control. You may address any correspondent to me at the Emperor's residence. As the seasons change, I follow him from palace to palace. He frowned with distaste. And how do I write to you? In care of the Huns? Rigvilia's domain is north of the Danube. Ask Attila for the rest, she answered. Her father urged his horse closer to her. With a leap, he dismounted before her. He opened his arms. You'd not deny your father a parting embrace? He asked. Helena hesitated before stepping into his arms. He held her close. He placed his mouth beside her ear and whispered in Persian, It's not over, Helena. Your barbarian signifies nothing. You're of my flesh, my bone. Until I relinquish you to a lawful husband, you're my property, as is the custom. No, father, she said, was unsuccessful in pulling away. Yes, daughter, he said, suddenly relinquished her, yet his hands remained on her shoulders. Farewell, until we meet under more auspicious circumstances. Then he lowered his tall frame and kissed her full on the lips. Shocked, Helena recoiled from him. His response was a twisted smile. It is my right as your father, Helena, he stated. Somehow I disagree, she replied coolly. Yet as she turned from him, her cheeks blazed with shame. As he remounted his waiting charger, he laughed. Yet the look he gave Arisames was far from jovial. He quickly arched his right eyebrow and then nodded almost imperceptibly. The next instant he became remote, even haughty. Stepping well away from him, Lena said, Be well, father, then wiped her lips with the back of her hand. His answering stare was fervent. Remember what I said, daughter. He bowed with a mocking flourish of his hand. Until our next meeting, he added. Time to leave, Michelia. Valimir growled as he loomed above him. In a moment, Valimir was astride Hassan, blocking Helena from her father. I'll wait here, Valimir, she said. He smiled. I won't be long. Yet her father averted his face as he rode forward. Altair called out to her, I won't forget you. As Lena waved, her view of Altair was blocked by the horse following Michelia. Wrapped in a rough cloth, a long bundle was tied to its back. Flies buzzed around it. Lena stared. Her eyes widened as she saw human hair dangling from one end, red with blood. She gagged, covering her mouth with her hand as she realized that it was Rodinia's corpse. Witnessing her reaction, Attila winked with a smile, as if trying to lighten her mood. Deep in her bones, Helena understood that her father and the Hun had reached beyond the barriers of civilization to embrace the other as a brother, sharing a fascination with torture and death. Along with Rhys, Lena tried to help as he made preparations to leave. The tents were in the process of being taken down, and understood that the tribe would travel at night. She was glad to be busy. She did not want to dwell on her encounter with her father. It disturbed her too much. She kept her eyes on Valimir and her father in the distance, and still surrounded by an armed guard. They moved closer to the rear of the Hunnic line. Wanting to see the hostage exchange, she stopped helping Rhys and scanned the distant Persian ranks, trying to find Thudamir. She breathed with relief as she saw his blonde hair flash in the sun. Suddenly, Rhys leapt to attention. Alarmed, Helena followed his gaze, but saw only Karachapan hobbling quickly toward them. She shouted in Persian, "Karachapan, slow down! You'll hurt yourself." He called back, "Helena!" but his words were muffled as he gasped for breath. "I can't hear you," she exclaimed. Running to meet him, she hastily scanned the forces to the far left. Bevian and Ishite had reunited with Attila and Valamir in the long corridor between the two lines. Her eyes caught a glimpse of a solitary Persian riding south, his horse galloping in her direction. As he passed within an arrow's shot of the camp, Helena's arm singled with apprehension. Suddenly she questioned Valamir's wisdom in placing his tent at the camp's perimeter. As she neared Karachapan, she heard running footsteps behind her. She whirled to face her pursuer, but only saw Reese limping after her. Trying to dismiss her feelings of dread, she smiled at him, but as she saw the lone Persian soldier wave a blue cloth with rhythmic precision as a signal, her smile died. Karachapan shouted to be heard over the gust of wind. "Helena, call Pasiel. Something's wrong. He'll be safer mounted." Not questioning him, she whistled for the white stallion. He answered with a whinny, cantering to her, with his tail raised high, streaming behind him. Her legs turned to lead when she saw a small band of mounted Persians erupt from behind a hill, galloping toward her, their quarry. In Gothic, Reese shouted, "To me!" But the bulk of Hun's fighting force was out of earshot, leaving the women slaves and the few children to scurry for cover. Reese grabbed a long staff leaning against a tent and positioned himself between Helena and the abductors. Pasiel watched her, his eyes alert and ready. Not being asked, Reese gave her a leg up on the horse. "Go on," he shouted, slapping Pasiel hard on the rump, urging him in the direction of Valamir and the Hunnic force. As the white stallion plunged forward, Helena held on for life, digging her heels into his sides, pushing him into a run, leading the Persians away from Karachapan and Reese, protecting them. Behind her, she heard horses thundering in pursuit, but did not look back. The situation ached with bitter familiarity, echoing her memories of Grelia's attack. With her knees, she guided Pasiel within the camp, away from the Hunnic line, knowing her flight in full view of the two armies would act as a catalyst for battle. As she rode through the many tents, she prayed that no small child would dart into the path of the horse's hoofs. Suddenly a Persian, astride a large black horse, blocked her way. She sat back on Pasiel, her weight signaling him to stop, and she touched her right heel to his side, urging him left. They bounded from the soldier's trap, and his smile of triumph faded into a scowl. The Persian horses pounded after her, steadily gaining. Suddenly she saw a small brown horse carrying a Hunnic rider. The animal was stretched out at a run, low to the ground, heading towards her. As Pasiel brought her near, she recognized Grelia, his face a mask of death. With the Persians at her back, she despaired, having no place else to run but forward. Grelia's bow was in his hands, an arrow aimed at her heart. Pasiel galloped steadily, bringing her within range. As Grelia released the shaft, she screamed in terror, but she felt the wind whistle as it passed her ear. Behind her, it met flesh with a dull thud. Compelled to look, Helena turned to see a Persian soldier with his hand to his throat, the end of an arrow protruding through his bloodied fingers. Like a rag doll, he fell limply to the ground and moved no more. Another shaft swept the air. A horse screamed as it took the flint in its neck, dropping to the ground in a heap. Grelia's smile was a grimace. With practiced smoothness, he pulled out his sword. His eyes scanned her face. He grunted with recognition, but allowed her to pass unharmed. His throat opened in a blood-curdling yell, answered by other Huns galloping their horses to his aid. Behind her, Grelia's sword sang its battle song. Pasiel carried her onward into a path of another Persian horseman. His sword was drawn, aimed at the white stallion. With hate she shouted, "You won't take me!" He laughed at her derisively. "I'll kill your horse." She drew her dagger, urging Pasiel to leap away from the Persian's blade. but his horse matched her maneuver, keeping position at her side. From his saddle, he extracted a small coiled whip. He snapped it, knocking her dagger from her hand. As he reached for her, his eyes widened with surprise. An arrow met his throat, followed by another to his eye. Blood spurted from his wound, spraying Helena with a red haze. Pasiel snorted and jumped. The Persian fell ignominiously to the ground, dead. Turning left, she looked for her rescuer and saw Valimir, astride his son, many strides away. She blinked back tears. Valimir, she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, with a mixture of fear and relief. Trembling, she forced herself to glance back at Grilia. Though upright, his horse and he were dirty with blood. He was badly wounded, barely able to stay astride. The 3 Persians who had fought him, hand to hand, had not survived. One had lost his head, but the other 2, judging from their number of jagged openings in their bodies, had taken longer to kill. Beyond Grilia, she saw another corpse, the Persian who had taken the first arrow. Another black horse lay near, dead, but Helena did not see its rider. She scanned the area with sudden urgency and caught a glimpse of the last Persian, fading behind one tent to the next. With his sword drawn, he made a dash towards Grilia, thirsting for glory instead of life. Unaware of his danger, Grilia dropped his head to his chest as if in fulfillment of her curse. Helena could not keep silent. Despite everything, for reasons she could not understand, he had saved her. In her heavily accented Gothic, she shouted, "Grilia, behind you!" The warning was enough. With effort, he wheeled his horse from the attacker's sword. Instantly, many arrows rained on the Persian, mortally wounding him. When Valimir reached her, he leapt from Hassan and pulled her into his arms, kissing her. He whispered, "I thought I'd lost you." Returning his embrace, she began to cry. The words came out with a sob. "Grilia, save me." Valimir pulled back enough to see her face. He chose his words with care. As punishment, Attila had forbidden him to ride with us. By defending you, he upheld the tribe and brought honor to himself instead of shame. She lowered her head. Her feelings overwhelmed her, but she had no tears. "But for my warning, he'd be dead. I don't know why I didn't hold my tongue," she said with bitterness. "A man could not have done better," Valimir said. She shook her head. A deep cry chased the air currents, resonated in her ears. "Helena! Helena!" her father repeated over and over again. She looked at the Persian line and saw him alone, slightly in front of his men. The distance made him appear small. She stared at him and remembered the courtyard in Constantinople, the fresh smell of the fountain, and the blazing mosaic of the Phoenix. She sighed. That father was lost to her. This father was another story, and for a later time. He was not finished with her yet. "Are you sure?" Valimir asked, but his eyes belied his words. "How could you ask? You know who I want." He smiled. His blue eyes were soft as he touched her cheek, then her hair. A crowd of Huns had gathered around Grilia, now off his horse and prone on the ground. As the shaman approached, the throng was hushed. Without understanding why, Helena slid from Valimir's arms and walked silently towards her fallen enemy. At the fringe of her vision, she saw Attila astride his black stallion, watching as the men made room for her to pass. She was aware of Valimir's hand pressing hers. Silently, she observed the shaman's administrations to Grilia. From a small leather pouch, he poured liquid down the injured man's throat, and then methodically pressed points on his body in a specific pattern. The shaman spoke in Hunnic to Valimir. "He wants us to come near," Valimir translated. As they approached, the shaman's eyes were fixed on Helena. Holding his gaze, she was in the moment, in an unexpected harmony to its rhythm. Grilia moaned. His suffering transformed him from evil incarnate to just a man. Again the shaman spoke, looked straight at her. Valimir translated. "He asked you to remove the curse. He is unable to lift it. Without your help, Grilia will die." Valimir paused, listening. "He tells me in the end the curse will corrupt you, drawing you down the same path as your enemy. The darkness extracts a heavier price from you than its victim. He begs you to save yourself and release Grilia." Lena's heart burned, and her feelings inundated her. In her mind's eye, the image of the crone came to her unbidden, but strong. She was the crone, all alone in foggy grayness. Two passed before her, and she knew that the shaman spoke the truth. She looked at Greeley again. His wounds were grievous. Blood oozed from his stomach, his arms, and his chest. He was struggling to breathe. Death approached him, with or without her help. The shaman nodded as if to recognize that she had seen the truth. She hesitated and then decided she would not tip the balance. In Persian, she whispered, "Forgive me, Mikhail. I must do this or be no better than my father." She bent down, close enough to touch the Hun. Her throat was constricted, fighting against her words. The shaman watched her without judgment and steadied her with his eyes. She accepted the gift of his strength and turned inward to her soul. Using ancient Persian, she spoke softly. "I ask the wise Lord to forgive me. I have been proud, arrogant, not trusting his justice, holding to the Dark One for revenge. I ask the wise Lord to intercede, to free me from my hate and from my connection to this Hun, the murder of my son." She paused, and she touched Giulia's forehead, no longer aware of the shaman or even the outside world. She added in a hoarse whisper, "I remove myself from being the judge and executioner of this man. I leave him to the justice of the wise Lord. Giulia, through all time and space, I revoke any and all curses against you cast by me." She removed her hand from him. A woman's voice rang out. "No! Helena, let him die!" Magda screamed in the language of the Arels. Unperturbed, Helena observed Magda struggling in a soldier's arms and fighting to intervene. The woman's face was contorted as if she choked. Her eyes bulged. "Magda, I do what I must." Helena responded in the same language. "He saved me. His fate is up to God." She returned her attention to Giulia. Her voice was soft. "I ask the wise Lord to forgive me for letting the darkness flow through me, channeling it to this world." Giulia's eyes fluttered open. When he saw her, they reflected fear. "My son's blood is on your hands. Nothing can change that. Justice will find you, but it's the wise Lord's choosing, not mine. I put you in the light, Giulia, so that you will find your destiny, whatever it is," she finished in Hunnic. She stared at him one last time, knowing that she would never forgive him for his crime. Mikhail's face was vivid in her mind. She hungered to feel him safe in her arms, just once more. Revenge felt as dry as dust in her mouth. Unless the shaman would heal him, Giulia's death would be soon, just not through her own contriving. Slowly she traced the rune of light above Giulia's chest. For a moment she closed her eyes. As she stood, she clapped her hands twice, hard. She spoke to the shaman. "It is done." The shaman's eyes bored into hers. He added once, in recognition of her choice, "Be at peace," he said in Hunnic. Deep in her heart, Helena understood that by releasing Giulia to his fate, she had saved herself. Feeling obscurely cleansed, she took a deep breath. She returned to Valamir and was suddenly aware of the silent crowd. Magda was crying, her face swollen from tears. For once, Helena did not mind being the focus of so many stares. The Hun's force stood between her and the Persian army. Out of the corner of her eye, she glimpsed Sudamir and Ishiite. They were safe. The camp bustled with activity around them, preparing to break camp. She forgot her father, the crowd, the dark, hollow voice that had filled her with such malevolence in the past. Her heart was open to this tall, blond man who had so implausibly become her true husband. She smiled and reached for Valamir's hands. "Let's go, my love," she said. And that's the end of that book. So people have asked me if I'm going to do a sequel, and I have intended to, but I should do a sequel, but I got distracted by my next book, and which is actually 2 books, and it could be a third. It should be a 3rd book. So I'll be talking about that more. How it's going to be published and what I'm going to do. So it's been fun. I was hoping that by the time I finish this, the pandemic would be over and we'd be back to normal. But we still have to be careful. And look, but the vaccination is coming.